It is my honor to introduce one of Mr. Reagan's earliest heroes. This founding father championed small government, penned the Declaration of Independence, doubled the size of the United States, and looked west with boundless optimism for the people of the new republic. Reagan in his old age would joke that he knew this founding father personally. And this evening, we too have the privilege of getting to know him a little better. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the third President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson.
I can tell by the music I'm here in Western Virginia, am I not? Here out in the wilderness, on the frontier, what a pleasure it is to travel this far. And is it not the most remarkably unrecorded moment in our nation's history that we can all be together? I declare that I've made good time on horseback. It's only taken me several months from Washington City. And as you know, I still make the same time no matter where I travel as I did when I was a young man. Brought up in the wilderness of Virginia, traveling eastwards 120 miles to the city of Williamsburg, where I attended the school, read law, practiced the law, elected to my first public office. Do you know, it still takes me 5 days in the saddle to travel 120 miles. Those of you who own a horse would well understand you never ride any farther in one day's ride than about 35 or 40 miles. You never travel any faster in the saddle than about 5 miles an hour. That is a comfortable pace. If you tried to ride 6 or 7 miles an hour, it would cause immediate indigestion. And consider most people across the globe do not even own a horse now, do they? Horses are expensive to purchase, to breed. No, most people travel one place to the other. How so? Walk, your own God-given method of transportation, your own 2 legs. It shall take you comfortably about 3 miles an hour, which is a point I delight to ponder in the saddle. The calculation of the average rate of speed upon the globe as I know it, between the minority, those who are privileged to own a horse and ride comfortably 5 miles an hour, and yet the great majority who have not that privilege walk comfortably 3 miles an hour. And there you have it. Imagine, after all of these years, it still remains a 4-mile-an-hour world, does it not? That is the world that I know. I know of no place upon the globe where you can travel any faster than a ship at sea or a horse on land. I will not deny there have been remarkable advances. This extraordinary steam-empowered mechanical device. Will we ever get over the news that my fellow collaborator on our declaration, Robert R. Livingston, and our friend, Robert R. Fulton, improved the steam engine? They put it in a boat on the Hudson River to sail the distance between the port of New York and Albany City, a distance of 150 miles. And it covered that distance in 36 hours. Is that not phantasmagorical? What is next? Citizens, I hope we never forget, whatever may transpire shortly, for the improvement of transportation and the more swift conveyance of information, that we never forget the principles that we installed, that we created using our own hands and our own mind to become the first people in the history of man to found a nation upon principle, not upon monarchy, nor upon aristocracy. Principles that have been argued and debated from time immemorial as to whether man is capable of governing himself. And is it not extraordinary in our young nation, many of our fellow citizens, they do not believe so. No, not as yet. No, they express their mind freely. And where would they be more free to express their mind so than here, a citizen of this extraordinary nation, and at the same time to be opposed by others, their fellow citizens who freely express their opinion, and to recognize collaboratively that we made a remarkable achievement in human history, that in the midst of the diversity of our opinions, we brought together 13 individual nations. It should continue to provoke us. How did we ever do it? Each one of those nations divided in the tedium of their own political differences. and yet recognizing they would have to reconcile, compromise, in order to move forward for the common good. That is what was achieved in Philadelphia in 1776. You know, as I dismounted out of doors, I took off my riding boots, I put on my shoes, and I dusted myself off. I thought, well, I'd be looked upon as rather peculiar in my apparel, so I ventured to tell you I conjured up an apology until I heard my introduction, and when I walked in, gazing amongst all of you, I wondered, why should I apologize for the apparel I have tonight? I've always believed in dressing for comfort, but you overwhelm me in that regard. And now I find I'm rather the overdressed in what has become quite the modern cut of a gentleman's suit of clothes since the turn of the century. Perhaps you've noticed gentlemen have been cutting away their old frock coats. Oh, the frocks were so fashionable before, during, after the American Revolution. I remember vividly in Williamsburg, a proud gentleman would button his frock all the way down to his knees. You rarely see them any longer. Gentlemen have been cutting away the points of their waistcoats. And I declare, without the excess of material, this is far more comfortable in the saddle. I'm never a day out of the saddle. It appears that the age of the cocked hats is now in the past. Gentlemen are now sporting top hats, growing ever the higher. But you can see I'm still old-fashioned. I enjoy wearing breeches. Well, I'm very comfortable in breeches, easy to put on and take off your boots. I have not succumbed to this modern fashion of gentlemen's pantaloons buttoning all the way to... I declare some of our women folk are sporting them as well. You must all be from France, are you, Everett? I beg your pardon, citizens. I know this must seem contrary to what you've read in the newspapers, what you may have heard by word of mouth, that Jefferson is an American sphinx, solemn, reticent, cerebral. No, quite the contrary. Speak with my family and my friends. They will tell you I'm unrestrained in conversation. And the mere point of my meandering into the subject of fashion is to remind us, as I have often written, in matters of fashion, simply swim with the current. In matters of principle, let us continue to stand like a rock. As Americans, never let us allow a difference of opinion to allow for a difference in principle. We are all Federalists. We are all Republicans. And I welcome this opportunity this evening to be introduced to others who I know hold the same mind upon principle, the same mind upon free expression, the same mind of a government invigorated of, by, and for the people. And I look forward to making their acquaintance as I have looked forward to being here in your presence. I thank you. Godspeed.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. It is now my honor to introduce a Republican president whose portrait was brought into the Oval Office shortly after this president was inaugurated, and there it would hang for the next 8 years. Mr. Reagan admired this president's determination to cut taxes and keep the national government within well-defined limits. He also admired the toughness this former Massachusetts governor showed when a police force went on strike, saying, and I quote here, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge.
You know, we talk about Jefferson, but we do not follow him. Any man who had as many ideas as Thomas Jefferson did was bound to find that some of them would not work out. Yet, in his advocating that the people of America be left to manage their government and not be managed by it, he was everlastingly right. I was born on the 4th day of July, 1872, in the town of Plymouth, Vermont, in a 5-room, story-and-a-half cottage attached to the post office and the general store, of which my father, John Calvin Coolidge, was the proprietor. He was successful. He trusted nearly everybody. And sometimes people would return and they would pay him their entire bill, and he had never thought he was going to see them again. Well, it was at our homestead in August of 1923 that we received the news that President Harding had died in San Francisco at the Palace Hotel. And of course, at the homestead, we had no electricity, we had no telephone, and there was a telephone in the general store, but its ringing couldn't wake up the proprietor. And so a fellow drove up from Woodstock, knocked on our door sometime after midnight, and woke up my father. They conversed, and then my father came up the stairs calling my name. His voice trembled, and I knew that something of the gravest nature had occurred. He placed in my hand an official report. He had been the first to address me as President of the United States, for President Harding had died. Well, the oath of office was taken in what we always called the sitting room by the light of the kerosene lamp. The Bible that had belonged to my mother lay on the table at hand. I know of no other case in history where succession comes by election, where the qualifying oath of office is administered by a father to his son. It seemed a simple and a natural thing to do at the time. I can now appreciate something of the dramatic force of the event. Later, the newspaper reporters asked my father what made him think that he had, as a notary, the authority to administer the presidential oath. He said there was nothing that made him think he didn't have it. Well, will I make a speech tonight? I don't know if I get cornered up by people wanting me to make speeches, and it is represented to me that on this occasion I am the only individual that can save the progress of civilization, and that if I am not to do it, civilization will fail. When that proposal is made, it is hard for one to say they won't make a speech. But I shouldn't want you to ascertain anything one way or the other about my making speeches or not making speeches. I found in the course of a long public career that the things I did not say never hurt me. I remember a fellow who went down from Vermont. He went down to Texas, and he attended a large political gathering. And in the course of that gathering, at one point, the speaker said, "How many Republicans are there in this audience?" And no one put up their hand, and finally this fellow from Vermont put up his hand. And the speaker looked at him and then said, would you, sir, would you stand up? And the fellow stood up. And the speaker said, "Why are you a Republican?" And the fellow from Vermont said, "Well, you know, my father was a Republican, and his father before him. I suppose that is why I am a Republican." And the speaker in Texas said, "Why, that is no reason at all. If your father or your grandfather had been a horse thief, would that make you one too?" And the fellow from Vermont said, "No, I suppose in that case I would have been a Democrat." I recall an occasion when I was out walking in Washington with my Secret Service man, Colonel Edmund Starling, and we rounded the corner, and that familiar White House on Pennsylvania Avenue came into view, and Colonel Starling said to me, he said, "Well, President Coolidge, who lives there?" I said, "Nobody. Nobody lives there. They just come and go." When you are president, you have to stand every day 3 or 4 hours of visitors. 9/10 of them want something they ought not to have. I found that if you will keep dead still, after a while they'll start to wind down. But if you even cough or smile, they'll start up all over again. So I repeat, I found in the course of a long public career, the things I did not say never hurt me. My last public address was at Madison Square Garden in New York City in October of 1932. We were trying to get that great engineer, Herbert Hoover, another term in office. After my address, which was broadcast on the radio, a lady rushed up to me and she said, "Oh, Mr. Coolidge, what a marvelous address. I stood up all through it." I told her, so did I. She said if she could only vote for me, it would be the end of our horrible depression. I told her it would be the beginning of mine. Well, I was trying to cheer up President Hoover because it didn't matter what he did to halt the spiral of depression. Nothing produced a beneficial result, and he tried many, many imaginative measures, but nothing produced a good result. And as I say, I tried to cheer him up. I said, "Well, Hoover, you know, they can't expect to see calves running in the field the morning after you put the bowl to the cow." Hoover said, "No, but you would expect to see contented cows." He always wondered how I was able to transact so much business when I was in Washington. And I said, "Well, you know, the trouble with you, Hoover, you talk back to them." When they elected that Superman, I knew he was going to have trouble. He was going to have to spend money, and he did. But it just will not produce a beneficial result, and the Democrats will get in and they will spend money like water. But they don't know anything about money, and they'll want me to come back and save money for them. But I won't do it. I won't. I feel I no longer fit in these times. When I was president, we succeeded on measures of tax reform, peace, and the economy. I read of the newfangled things that are now so popular, and I realize that my time is gone. When I left Washington, I addressed, I spoke from the rear platform of the train as we were pulling out of the Union Station, and I said to the crowd assembled there, I said, "Goodbye. I've had a very fine time here in Washington. Thank you."
Thank you, Mr. Coolidge. Now it is my honor to introduce the Democratic president, for whom Ronald Reagan voted 4 times. A great communicator in his own right, this former New York governor had the uncanny ability to connect with the people in his radio addresses. All his life, Mr. Reagan admired this public servant's optimism and the way this president marshaled the resources of the national government, first to confront economic problems and then a wartime machine abroad. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 32nd President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt.
Oh, there. Isn't that perfect? You know, I love that song. Did you all hear that? Happy days are here again. I'm very proud to be here. Gentlemen, good evening.
Good evening, sir.
Very proud to be here in Grand Rapids and to address all of you this evening. This is quite a treat for me. I'm thinking back of the number of changes that have taken place here in our great nation since the time of Mr. Jefferson. Great changes indeed. And I'm sure all of you remember what this nation was like when I took the oath of office in 1933. Well, we were in a terrible fix. 1/4 of the workers out of work. Factories shut down, people losing their savings, their homes, and their farms. A great pall had descended over our great nation, and people were beginning to doubt the merits of our American ideals. They were beginning to say, well, democracy doesn't work. A republic doesn't work. We need to look at people like Mr. Mussolini, what he's doing, or Mr. Hitler, what he's doing. Take lessons from them. They had lost confidence in themselves and in our American way of life. And as I look back over those dark days, perhaps I'm most proud of being able to go on to the radio and tell the American people, no, there's nothing wrong with you. You have not made a mistake. The ideals of America are still strong, the ideals that were established by our founders, that we are a republic, an independent nation of interdependent people. And if we act as such, if the farmer, the businessman, the miner, all join hands and move forward together, we indeed cannot fail. And that is what happened. Everybody came together and began to work. Business was unable or unwilling, in some cases, to provide employment. Well, then it became the job of the people's government to be the employer of last resort, with programs such as the CCC, the PWA, the WPA, all of which were established to give people work. Because I was convinced that people didn't want a handout, they wanted a hand up. They wanted to be helped, that they desired the pride of employment, and that is what we provided them, until such time as business got back on its feet and could provide those jobs on their own. This was part of a big bill that I came up with in 1933. That's what we always called it, was the big bill. Again, with the idea that the government, your government, is a positive force in the lives of the people, because the government is your servant. I think people lose track of that fact. They begin to think that the government is simply for themselves. But the government is the servant of the people. Always. Always. And it is the people who must determine how that government functions. You must keep an eye on it. It is yours. I seem to think that there are those today who see the government as the enemy. It's the enemy. How can it be the enemy? It's your government. And it is a faithful servant. Now, what would a faithful servant do? A faithful servant will, if your desires are made known, you, the master, express your desires that you want thus and so, a faithful servant will go out and beg, steal, or more commonly, borrow to see that you get it. A faithful servant. But you must be the governors. Somewhat after my time, there'll be a very wise man who will say, government can't solve the problem, government is the problem. Well, I would suggest it's not government that's the problem, it's governance. Personal and of those of the representatives, those in Congress who represent us, having the willpower, the vision to do what is right for America. This business of deficit spending, and certainly during the Depression, the deficit began to mount even more to astronomical heights during this terrible war, during times of emergency. But this was a necessity, a necessity. We could not have survived those two crises in our nation's history without it. And I'm convinced that the deficit will be paid off. But it must not happen again except in times of dire emergency, when it is the life of the nation which is at stake. that is when we must dip into the cookie jar. That is when we must borrow money to help us along, with the idea that it will be paid back very quickly. Now, I know some of you will point your fingers at me and say, well, this is the father of the deficit sitting right here. Well, I have to tell you, I was always convinced of the old philosophy of economics, that you don't spend more than you take in. And when I came into office, I cut the federal employees. I cut the budget with the idea from the very beginning of balancing the budget. Well, I couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Well, people would say, well, you've got all these programs that are going to cost all of this money. How are you going to pay for it? It's bad for the economy in the long run. Well, Harry Hopkins had an answer for that. He said, people don't eat in the long run. They eat every day. We had to do it. In 1937, I thought we were far enough along that I could begin to withdraw some of these public programs, to reduce the funding, to start eliminating this debt, and to eventually balance our accounts. Well, that led to what the Republicans glowingly called the Roosevelt recession in 1937. Obviously, we weren't far enough along, and so I had to increase the spending again, back to the former levels. We all love America. We all wish it to be successful. It doesn't matter whether you're Democrat or Republican or independent. We all pray for its success. And through the years, we have come through many crises. But what we have found always, is that we are most able to beat these crises, to get over these bumps in the road, by joining hands and working together. That's the secret of America. That's the magic of America, where there are no aristocrats, where there's no one to beg for favor, where we join hands and do the hard work to bring us successfully to the future. And that is what I look forward to in this nation, and I hope that future generations will look back and not repeat some of the mistakes that administrations have made in the past. Learn from history. Learn from it. It's a wise, wise teacher. Well, I'm nattering on too much, so I'm going to stop now. Thank you. Mr. Coolidge.
Thank you, Mr. Roosevelt. It is my privilege now to introduce the Democratic president, whom Mr. Reagan referenced in a number of conversations and speeches. The way this former Massachusetts senator appealed to our nation's youth, and how he took a tough stand against communists during the Cold War. He also thought this president's Harvard education gave him a good grasp of economics, especially when he called for tax cuts to stimulate the economy. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 35th President of the United States, John Kennedy.
Mr. President, Mr. Gleaves, how are you? Ladies and gentlemen, I do not think it entirely inappropriate to begin my remarks by expressing my gratitude to some of you who might have voted for me in 1960. Michigan did go for Kennedy in 1960. You all are perhaps familiar with the returns. I barely beat Vice President Nixon. It was comfortable in the Electoral College, 303 to 219. But up to my trip to Dallas, I did oftentimes carry a slip of paper in my pocket to remind me of the razor-thin margin of victory over Nixon in the popular vote, 118,574. Now also I found out when the Gallup organization broke down all of the data. It said if women had been the only ones voting in 1960, Vice President Nixon would have won comfortably. And after getting over that piece of information, after my recovery, I should have taken my father at his word. He said, "Jack, I'm not going to pay for a landslide." And I should have, he said that. And so from then on out, thenceforward. But when I was running for President of the United States, and my esteemed predecessors here on stage talking about leadership, not salesmanship, is what is needed from a chief executive. That's what I said repeatedly during the campaign of 1960, and I would reiterate it throughout till my trip to Dallas in 1963. I was the first president to come into office when you had an adversary, the Soviet Union, United States, as well, that adversarial relationship, nuclear arsenals, capable of killing 300 million people in the short space of a day. And so the great issues of war and peace would constantly preoccupy me. But I was also fascinated, so the gentleman behind me, when it comes to leadership. And what does it take to be a great leader? Going back to childhood, I was so very young. Many people don't realize, and I would have never said this in my lifetime, but I was born with a bad back, and yes, I did have Addison's disease, and some had called me a medical miracle, that I was even able to walk certain days. And of course, growing up, I wanted people to believe that I was an otherwise normal boy who was just sick a great deal of the time. And of course, my mother was so good in providing me with all kinds of reading material, history, biography. I became fascinated with those who held positions of authority and power. Of course, was inspired by them. And of course, I wanted to go on and be an inspiration to others. But many of you who know my story, came from a large family, and I think that alone was preparation for leadership. I 8 brothers and sisters, and of course I was the second born and the second son. And so my brother, as you perhaps well know, was groomed to be President of the United States. And people had asked, what might you do, or what might you have done had Joe not died in World War II? And I was thinking perhaps that I would go into teaching, or perhaps journalism, maybe even the law. Of course, Joe was killed in 1944, and I remember my father. He went into seclusion for about a month. And of course, he loved listening to certain records. He would listen to the same records over and over. And so when he finally emerged, he told me what, of course, we already knew, that Joe was gone, and that I needed to step up and to take his place. People think that I was drafted by my father to run for president, to be the first Irish Catholic president of the United States. But the truth was and is, I wanted it. I wanted to run for office, and once I ran for the Congress in 1946 and had my first taste of it, real taste of it, I found that I liked it, and I wanted more. Served 3 terms in the Congress, House of Representatives, and then ran for the United States Senate in 1952 and won. Ran for re-election in 58 and won. And then ran for the presidency in 1960. And as you know, barely won. So I thank you again, those of you who did vote for me. And perhaps a few Republicans out there who were under the impression that I was my father's son voted for me as well. When I took the oath of office in 1961, I asked my fellow Americans to ask not what their country could do for them, but what they could do for their country, and tried to continue that theme throughout, particularly with the Peace Corps. Now, I was here in Michigan in October of 1960, and at 2 a.m., I appeared on the campus of University of Michigan before 10,000 students. 2 in the morning, 10,000 students. And it was in a speech on that October 14th, 1960, that I alluded to my intention to create a Peace Corps. And I'd asked members of that audience, how many of you would like to go into public service? And of course, public service, you know the reputation of politicians, not the greatest. And some polls, used car salesmen, poll higher than politicians. So the most maligned, mistreated of the professions, and of course I wanted to change that. I wanted to inspire the young people in particular to go into public service, for it was and is worthy. And so for the first time, as I was traveling around the state of Michigan, the number of students, the number of young people who came up and said, you know, we want to go serve our country. We don't want to, with respect in regard to financial considerations, so many college students, and it's understandable, they're thinking about a future paycheck. But for the first time here in Michigan, I was sensing that many of the students, that wasn't their primary consideration, that it was serving the public. And I know many did eventually go into the Peace Corps and serve in other capacities, and perhaps were inspired to run for office. So all of those considerations as far as the great issues of war and peace, inspiring the youth of this country, that's what I believe the election of 1960 was about. That's what I believe at core, the essence of my presidency was about. And so I thank you. I'm going to sit down and join my esteemed colleagues, and I look forward to speaking more with you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Well, and now, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor that I introduce the president whose 100th birthday we celebrate this evening. This former governor of California was known as the Great Communicator. He's a tax cutter and a cold warrior. He was determined to restore pride in America. His optimism about the American people guided his philosophy, his politics. So not surprisingly, his philosophy of governance was simply get big government out of the way and let the people solve their own problems and create a better future. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan.
Well, my fellow Americans, I can't tell you how happy I am to be here tonight, to be with some of the greatest influences of my life here too. Thomas Jefferson, Calvin Coolidge, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Jack Kennedy, and of course, Gleaves. Everybody's favorite butler. Anyway, you know, when I became president, many people had their ideas, and they thought that maybe I was just a little bit too old to be president. But it was Tom Jefferson who said we should not judge a president by the number of his years, but by his works. And believe me, when Tom told me that, I knew I was home safe. The path for any president, of course, is not set in stone. As a young man who grew up in Dixon, Illinois, our family didn't have a whole lot of money. And as a matter of fact, when I was 14 years old, I was offered a job. And boy, was this a doozy. A construction man asked me if I would dig ditches, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week for 35 cents an hour. Out of that, I saved $200, which I put towards my tuition at Eureka College. My friends, this taught me two valuable lessons. The first lesson is that the things that you most admire, you work the hardest for and mean the most to you. And the second thing is, who in the hell likes digging ditches? I'm telling you that right now. Sometimes it's better to know what you don't want to do. It helps guide you in the right direction. Well, as I was in Eureka College, now some of you may not know this, in my freshman year, I organized, believe it, a strike. We struck against the administration. We told them that they were trying to cut curriculum. But I banded together with fellow students, and good enough, there was Ronnie, the strike guy. It taught me a lot of things, because it taught me that if you really care about something, the first thing that you have to do is you have to gather people around you, people with like minds. And you have to go up against forces that sometimes you think you may not win. But we did. And as I graduated from college, I thought I was going to be a football star. I played there football 4 years, and by gosh, I thought I was pretty gosh darn good. But the pros thought otherwise, so I ended up getting a job with WHO radio in Des Moines, Iowa. There I was the announcer for the Chicago Cubs. Now, some of you may know this, but at the time announcing the games, it wasn't as if I was sitting in the ballparks. Often I would be sitting there and a ticker tape would come across and you would see the line and it would say Davis hits into a single. So there I would be. It's a great day at the ballpark, folks. Davis is standing up to the plate. He looks like he's determined. He's knocking the dirt off his cleats. He's blowing a Farmer John, or he's doing whatever the heck, and he's ready to hit. But you had to make it up as you go along. And that sure helped me when I became president, too. In my inaugural address, I told the American people, I said, some people think the government is the solution. Well, actually, the government is the problem. And of course, there's people who would say, after 8 years of governing the country, I proved my point. But no, that's not what it was. It was the idea of this: the government is the panacea of all people. You know what they say about government? This idea about things: if it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. I wanted to get America off the backs of the American people and get us starting to work. And there were many other things that I had to work against, and of course that was communism. I believe that there was an evil empire. I believe that there were people out there who wanted to end our way of life, and it was my job to do everything in my power to keep this from happening. Because as you know, what a lot of people say, what is a communist? Some people say a communist is someone who follows Marx and Lenin. And what is an anti-communist? That's somebody who actually understands what Marx and Lenin wrote about, too. But listen, I could go on like this for years, and, well, I did. But right now, before I sit down and take some questions, I do want to give out a special thanks to a dear friend who is not here with us tonight, Mr. Ralph Hauenstein. I used to call him Junior. Always had that guy by a year. But I'm glad to see that he is still active and still working and still has a great love for this country. And we are indeed grateful that he has done everything in his power and for this great city to establish this center too. So this is for Ralph. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Reagan, and thank you so much for that shout-out to Ralph Hauenstein. Well, you know, at this point, the presidents have agreed to put questions to each other. So, please, gentlemen.
If you will, I have a curiosity that perhaps Mr. Roosevelt may answer for me, gentlemen, and it is with no disinterest or disrespect in your messages, which have intrigued me greatly. But I am curious, Mr. Roosevelt, that, as you perhaps may know, I have come to represent the Democratical Republican platform, and therefore trying to understand your particular platform. You are wont to pronounce quite correctly, in my opinion, that government must always be the servant of the people, not the master. It governs through their recognition and their approbation, and that alone. And yet you are wont to go on to suggest that such a government should be responsible for deficit of spending. Now, the one I see as servant, the mission of the government, is strictly, indeed, in my opinion, Republican and very much a foundation of the Democratical Republican platform, and yet your other, that the government should support a deficit of spending, appears to me very federalist and Hamiltonian, suggesting large and central governments. As you know, I always objected to this particular philosophy of General Hamilton, so I'm curious, which do you stand upon? Is it Republican principle, Federalist principle, or Democratical Republican principle?
Yes.
You're a Federalist. That is the attention, sir. And I am curious indeed, are you related to one successful merchant in the port of New York by the name of Isaac Roosevelt?
Indeed I am.
You are a Federalist.
Well, Mr. Jefferson, you must understand, things have changed dramatically since your day. The day of the honest yeoman farmer who could control his means of production, through his own hard work, supply for himself and his family and his betterment, those days are largely over. We have become a great industrial power, perhaps the greatest on the face of the earth. Many don't work on the farms anymore. They don't own their own land. In fact, some don't own any land at all. They work for wages in the factories and the mines of our nation. And so the economics of this United States has been altered over the years. No one likes deficit spending. But I think you will agree that as the servant of the people, the government must see to the security and the opportunity of the people to survive, to better themselves, to have opportunity to go forward and fulfill those talents which God has given them. Well, some of these have been taken away from people, where you fought against, royalists to gain our freedom so that we would no longer be under their thrall. I myself have fought against economic royalists. And I believe that our government should be a servant to all the people, not simply those with big bank accounts. That's all the people. Now, as to the size of government, with the Depression, the size had to increase. But you'll notice, now that we're here in 1944, the CCC is gone. WPA is gone. I think government should expand and contract depending upon the needs of the people. And I think if we ever get to the point that this government is self-perpetuating, where it grows on its own, when suddenly politicians realize that I can be elected if I promise people I'm going to give them something for nothing, then we're going to be in a great deal of trouble. No. Again, governance in all things. That's the key to a republic, and I think you will agree.
I do indeed, Mr. Roosevelt. As you know, I have written that the only purpose of government and its laws is simply to protect its people from injury by one another. Otherwise, to leave them free, that they might pursue their own industry and their own improvement. Do we still have a national bank?
No, we do not. We have the Federal Reserve System.
Doesn't sound over to me.
Well, President Reagan, I have a question for you.
Fire away.
What in the world possessed you to become a Republican after voting for me for 4 times?
Well, you know, Frank, there's an old saying that if a man is 18 and he's not a Democrat, he has no heart. But if a man is 35 and he's not a Republican, he has no brain. No, what I believe that happened, and of course, you know, I'm a great admirer of yours, is when I became president, the top income bracket was taxed 70%. The top income bracket, anything that people made, they only got to keep 30%. When I left office, that same bracket was 28%. And some people would say that, well, you're just trying to make it easy for rich folks. No. I was just trying to encourage everyone else to get rich and reap the benefits too. It's more of kind of like the carrot and carrot approach.
A carrot and carrot. Very good.
I think Cal is going to sleep. We better ask him a question here.
I have a question I'd like to ask of the president. Why in 1928 did you choose not to run for office again, to run for re-election?
Well, of course, that was in August of 1927. I was out in South Dakota, and I held one of my twice-weekly press conferences at the Rapid City High School, and I had the reporters line up in front of me, and as they filed by, I gave each one of them a slip of yellow paper, and when they opened it up, it read, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. And many people speculated on what did I mean by the word chose. Well, I meant I did not choose to run for president in 1928. And as you look back at our presidents, you will usually find that in their second term, there are often some gravely disappointing occurrences, often embarrassing of nature. And it seemed to me a very good idea to get out while they still wanted me. If I had stayed in Washington, I would have been there for 10 years, and that seemed entirely too long. And aside from that, I chose not to run for president because I didn't see any opportunity for advancement.
Thank you.
Perfect.
I am inclined to believe accordingly, Mr. Reagan, and yet I've heard astounding information this evening with Mr. Roosevelt's revelation about becoming a nation of merchants and merchandising and industry and manufacture. You thereby say that their greatest advantage, the greatest opportunity they had, lest we forget, go to America. Come here, acquire land, an opportunity available to the 100th and 1,000th generation of farmers yet to come. I hope, sir, that we still have a title to our land. I hope, sir, that a farmer will recognize that he truly holds the reins of self-government for providing for himself his sustenance, the sustenance of his family, his neighborhood, his nation. he is not prone to someone that stands in between him and those who receive the product of his resources. Oh, so I look with great hope to what Mr. Reagan has said, and I hope that we can continue to claim the land and provide that as well for generations yet unborn.
He can talk, can he?
Well, moving along. In the final segment of this evening's program, 5 gentlemen here on stage have agreed to step out of character and field your questions as historians, actors, character interpreters. And first, I'd just like to say a word about each of the 5 so you get to know them just a little bit better. Starting from your left to the right, Bill Barker has been a frequent star at Hauenstein Center programs. He comes to us from Tidewater, Virginia, where he's been at Colonial Williamsburg and portraying Thomas Jefferson for about 18 years. Jim Cooke also has starred in Hauenstein Center programs. He's based in Quincy, Massachusetts, and he's regaled Americans as Calvin Coolidge, by my count, for more than 35 years. Paddy Morrissey hails from San Francisco and has been doing his Ronald Reagan shtick for more than a quarter of a century.
30 years.
John Hamant also comes to us from Colonial Williamsburg, where he has portrayed Franklin Roosevelt for more than 17 years. And Brian Hampton teaches high school in Virginia, and he's been entertaining audiences with his John Kennedy act for some 23 years.